The Committee on Information Policy, Census, and National Archives will come to order. Good afternoon and welcome to today's hearing entitled the 2010 Master Address Files, Issues and Concerns. Today's hearing will examine the quality and quantity of addresses encompassing the Master Address File. Before we begin today, I would first like to publicly express my condolences to the family and friends of Bill Sparkman. Mr. Sparkman was a census worker found murdered in Kentucky. This incident is extremely unfortunate and immensely troubling. Census workers are doing a great civic duty for their country, and it is intolerable that such violations occur. Further, I'd like to commend Director Groves on his efforts and concern for his employees. It is evident that the safety and well-being of census employees are of paramount concern to him. I, along with the subcommittee, await swift justice for those responsible for such a horrendous act. Also, I'd like to, on another note, I'd like to recognize a group of visitors here who are part of the House Democracy Partnership. We have 24 members of Parliament from 4 countries this week for a seminar on committee operations, with an emphasis on organizing and holding public hearings. The visiting members are observing video of a hearing and meeting with House staff and members to discuss the organization and conduct of hearings. And I want to welcome those members of Parliament here from the country of Kenya as well as Peru. Welcome, and hopefully you will get something out of this hearing, which I'm sure you will. And so, without further ado, on our panel we will hear first from Dr. Robert Groves, Director of the Census Bureau. Dr. Groves will provide the status of the Bureau's ongoing efforts to compile and update the Master Address File, including LUCA and its appeal process, special Gulf Coast initiatives, address canvassing, and group quarter validation. And welcome again, Dr. Groves. We will then hear from government witnesses who will testify and assess the compilation of the Master Address File. These witnesses will offer recommendations they believe will improve the Bureau's efforts. Our final testimony will come from a stakeholder who will discuss her organization's concerns about Census 2010. She will provide her organization's actual experiences with hard-to-count populations. She will also offer practical solutions to aid in the partnership between the Bureau and community-based organizations. And without objection, the chair and ranking minority member will have 5 minutes to make opening statements, followed by opening statements not to exceed 3 minutes by any other member who seeks recognition. Without objection, members and witnesses may have 5 legislative days to submit a written statement or extraneous materials for the record. And again, the purpose of today's hearing is to examine the Master Address File. This subcommittee is committed to reviewing the daunting and critical task of counting the population. This constitutionally mandated exercise has wide ramifications. The results are used to apportion legislative districts at the federal and state level. Moreover, the distribution of more than $400 billion annually in federal assistance to local, state, territorial, and tribal governments rely upon this count. Civic prestige, marketability, and regional political power also rest upon these numbers. As we look forward to April 1st, 2010, the subcommittee evaluates the status of the Bureau's efforts to count all inhabitants of this country. The master address file is an essential component of the 2010 decennial census. Thus, an assessment of the compilation of addresses is of fundamental interest and concern to the subcommittee. Today's hearing will focus on the Bureau's progress in the compilation, scheduling, cost, and transparency of the master address file. The subcommittee will explore all aspects of master address file, including but not limited to LUCA, the LUCA appeal process, address canvassing, update leave, special Gulf Coast initiatives, and budgetary matters. The Bureau's interaction and cooperation with local and county governments, community organizations, and stakeholders will further be explored. The success of the census is dependent on the quality of the address list. I thank the witnesses for appearing today and look forward to their testimony. I now yield to the distinguished ranking minority member, Mr. Chaffetz of Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all of you who are participating in this, and thank you very much for our guests. I hope you find this informative and appreciate your joining us here today. As we work on this very daunting, huge, massive task of trying to count every person in the United States of America, our timeline is short. Here we have less than 6 months to go, and undoubtedly the challenges will be huge. A particular concern that I'd like to make sure is, are we up to the task of making sure that everyone is fairly counted, that they're not undercounted and they're not overcounted, and that we have the tools necessary and the technology in place in order to make that happen. I have specific questions and concerns about the viability of the workforce that is being hired in order to do this enumeration, specifically the practice of hiring known criminals. I know the background checks and the fingerprinting have been an issue, and I appreciate an update along the way in that regard. And then I also have questions as to why we don't, or to what degree we do, utilize and tap into what we already do in the United States Postal Service. They already have a federal workforce of hundreds of thousands of people who go to every home, every address in this country. I recognize some have post office boxes and whatnot. There are certain challenges with illegally subdivided homes and whatnot, as Ms. Jacobs, I'm sure, will address. But with that being said, mapping out this country, why we are not more closely aligned with literally hundreds of thousands of people who do this on an almost everyday basis is something I think is worth at least a few questions along the way. And so I look forward to your testimony. I appreciate the interaction today. It's what this process is all about, and I thank the Chairman for the time.
I thank the gentleman from Utah, and would Mr. Westmoreland care to make an opening? No, thank you. Okay, then if there are no additional opening statements, we will now receive testimony from the witnesses before us today. And I want to start by introducing our panel. We will hear first from Dr. Robert Groves, Director of the Census Bureau. Dr. Groves has authored numerous books and articles. He was a recipient of the prestigious Julius Shiskin Memorial Award in 2008. He has a BA from Dartmouth and a Master's in Sociology and Statistics, and further earned a doctorate from Michigan. Dr. Groves' book, Non-Response in Household Interview Surveys with Mick Cooper, received the 2008 AAPOR Book Award. Dr. Groves began his tenure as director on July 15, 2009. Next, we will hear from Mr. Robert Goldenkoff, who currently serves as the Director of Strategic Issues at the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Goldenkoff is responsible for reviewing the 2010 census and government-wide human capital reform. He has also developed a body of work related to transportation security, combating human trafficking, and federal statistical programs. Mr. Goldenkoff's various works have been published in the Public Administration Review, Policy Studies Journal, Government Executive, and Technology Review. Thank you for being here. Next, we will hear from Mr. Todd Zinser, Inspector General of the Department of Commerce. As Inspector General, Mr. Zinser leads a team of auditors, evaluators, investigators, attorneys, and administrative staff responsible for promoting economy and efficiency and detecting and preventing fraud, waste, and abuse in the vast array of businesses scientific, economic, and environmental programs administered by the department and its 13 bureaus. Thank you, Mr. Zenzer, for coming today. Our final witness will be Ms. Eileen Jacobs from California Rural Legal Assistance. Ms. Jacobs is the Director of Litigation Advocacy and Training. She has spent 30 years of her legal career as an advocate for housing and civil rights in low-income communities in urban and rural United States. Ms. Jacobs taught housing law for the UC Davis Law School and Women and the Law for Yuba Community College. She obtained her BA from Boston University and JD from the Northwestern University School of Law. She has co-authored 2 publications on the undercount of farm workers and indigenous groups in the census. Ms. Jacobs is the CRLA delegate to the National 2010 Census Advisory Committee, for which she is chair of an ad hoc subcommittee on hard-to-locate housing units. Thank you all for appearing before the subcommittee today. It is the policy of the subcommittee that all witnesses, before they testify, be sworn in. And can I ask you to stand? I'd like to ask you to raise your right hand and repeat after me. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Each of you will have an opportunity to make an opening statement. Your complete written testimony will be included in the hearing record. The yellow light will indicate that it will be time to sum up, and that red light will indicate that your time has expired. Dr. Groves, you may proceed first.
Thank you. Chairman Clay, Ranking Member Chaffetz, other subcommittee members, I'm happy to be here to testify with regard to the master address file for the 2010 census. When I testified here on September 22nd, I noted at that time a set of professional judgments about the assessment of the 2010 preparations. And I noted at the end of this month we'd be finished with our internal evaluation, the master address file. I realized the schedules of the committee didn't work to hit that time exactly right. I'll tell you as much as we know, I promise, today, but there's still work to be done, and I'd be happy to meet with the full committee or any subset when we have that full report ready. Let me begin by reminding us of what the master address file is. It is literally an inventory of all the addresses and descriptions of units along with their geographical locations. It is the source of the mailing of all the questionnaires and delivery of decennial forms. So it is a big deal for the 2010 census, and the quality of that master address file is appropriately a target of this subcommittee's scrutiny. There are 3 major quality criteria that I'll talk about today. One is its completeness, its coverage. Does it contain all of the housing units in the United States? Secondly, are the addresses on each of those housing units complete? Can we mail, or the physical descriptions, can we mail or find the housing units in our later operations? And then third, do we know where these units are? Is the spatial accuracy what we need to have for a successful census? We've done 3 important things over the decade. I think it's important to know that we're designed to improve the quality of the master address file. The first thing that was done is a reflection of what happened in 2000. There was a result of the 2000 census that there were more duplicates in this frame than were expected. One source of the duplicates had to do with group quarters housing units, and we've blended those 2 lists together with a hope that that will reduce the kind of duplication we found in 2000. We've realigned all the streets and roads in the country to reflect changes over the decade, And we're fully using, in cooperation with the Postal Service, codes that determine how best to get forms to particular addresses, whether we should mail them or deliver them ourselves. We've also been updating this frame throughout the decade through, again, a cooperation with the Postal Service on the delivery sequence file, and then through our own field work in the American Community Survey and other surveys, especially in rural areas. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned the so-called LUCA program, which is a local update of census addresses. It plays, as you know, a critical role. It's a key, both symbolic and real cooperation with local and state governments throughout the country, as well as tribal governments. This is an important part of building the master address file. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you, along with Representative Maloney, former ranking member of the subcommittee, Michael Turner, Representative Michael Thompson, and a former ranking member of the full committee, Representative Tom Davis, for your support last year. You wrote a Dear Colleague letter in March, and you helped to spread the word about the LUCA program to your colleagues on the Hill, and it helped, as you'll see in just a few minutes. We invited in 2007 about 40,000 different tribal, state, and local governments to participate in this local program. About 11,500 of them registered. About 29% of the governments are represented by that 11,000. That's a disappointing number when you first see that, but those governments represent about 92% of the housing units in the country. So that's kind of the first evaluation of LUCA that one could mount, and one way to evaluate it is to compare it to what happened in 2000. In 2000, we had about 18,000 governments registered. They represented less than 92% of the total housing units in the country. So overall, on participation in LUCA, we had greater participation this decade than last, and that's something that we are grateful for. We received submissions reflecting changes to our address list from those local governments, from about 79% of the governments that had registered. That's about 8,100 governments. This compares to about 67% submission in the 98 LUCA and 48% in the 99 LUCA. So once again, the participation, the submission of these lists to us from the local governments was somewhat better than in 2000, another good sign. We then matched these addresses supplied by local governments against the master address file, and we sent out all those addresses for the address canvassing operation that took place in the summer. Let me mention a couple of things about other improvements in the local update program. We had a single cycle of review. This reduced the complexity of participating governments. We had a longer review period, 120 days versus 90. We allowed a variety of ways to participate that seemed to fit the different problems local governments were facing. We provided easy-to-use software that they could download on their desktops to help. And for the first time, we allowed state governments to represent lower governments within their states. That partially explains the lower count of participation of governments, but the higher percentage of housing units represented. The preliminary figures from this program show that about 8 million addresses were provisionally added to the master address file for verification. 30 million of the addresses submitted by the local update program matched addresses already on the file. And we had 2 million corrections to addresses. Then, as you know, over the summer in 2009, Census Bureau staff walked every street and road in the country and visited 145 million locations that consisted of the 145 million units on the then master address file. The only areas that were omitted from this were remote Alaska and parts of Maine. that represent about 35,000 households of the 134 million. I can give you the results of these of the address canvassing work. About 98 million addresses on that list of 145 million were verified as is. 20 million were corrected. Usually that was a street name correction, small changes. 5 million were moved to another block. 10 million were added. They weren't on the address list before, and they weren't on the LUCA submission list. So at the current time, the master address file consists of about 134 million records. That turns out to match independent estimates of the housing unit count. That's a good sign so far in our comparisons. The figures show that about 21 million addresses fall into either a delete or duplicate or non-residential category. 16 million of those were deletes. That is, we couldn't find them when we got out there. And about 4 million were duplicates that were found from other, found to exist in other places in the master address file. About 1 million of the addresses we had on the list were non-residential. They've now been omitted. 2 million of them were what we called other living quarters. These are things like assisted living facilities, dormitories, group homes, and we sort of set those aside, and right now, as we speak, there are people visiting those group quarters, because that was a problem in 2000, making sure we had all the unit identifications right in those group facilities. We're out there right now making sure we have correct unit identifiers, and that's going to pay off come spring when we do the measurement. With respect to the results of address canvassing on the local update cases themselves, our initial results show that about 66% of the LUCA addresses were deleted, identified as duplicate, or found to be non-residential. About 29% of the addresses were verified, corrected, or moved, and about 5% were unresolved in address canvassing, but will remain in the enumeration universe. We're now reviewing this operation, as I said at the opening, and I'm happy to get back to you when we have all of the evaluative results on that program. You know that we have other programs that will improve, hopefully, the master address file. We're right now out asking these same local governments to give us new construction updates. We've invited about 29,000 governments to participate in this. About 15,000 have already said yes, and we're off and running on that. We are also going to make other updates to this file. We're not through for 2010. We will get other updates from the U.S. Postal Service, from the delivery sequence file. We're going to have a count review program that's going to go out early in 2010, and then we're going to have updates from other field operations. Our attempt in this is to get the most up-to-date master address file we can. So let me sum up. I said there are 3 evaluative criteria for the master address file coverage. Is first, relative to 2000, I noted that fewer governments participated in the local update program, but they represented a higher proportion of all addresses in the country than 2000. I noted that state and local governments provided addresses that form about 2% of the total valid addresses on the file after address canvassing. And after address canvassing, the total number of units on the file is comparable to an independent estimate of the count of housing units in the country. The second criteria is the completeness of addresses, and we found about 2 million other living quarters that are now being revisited to get those addresses right, those identifiers right. We're expecting a lot of these to revert to a single housing unit by the time we're through with this operation. We continue to evaluate the current status of the master address file, and I'm hopeful that I could talk more about this in a later hearing in front of this committee. I thank the committee for this opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. We know you hit the ground running at the Census Bureau, and we thank you for your service. Mr. Goldencoff, you recognize 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McHenry, members of the subcommittee, I am pleased to be here today to discuss the Census Bureau's progress in building a complete and accurate address list. As you know, a quality address list, along with precise maps, are key to a successful census. If the Bureau's address list and maps are inaccurate, people can be missed, counted more than once, or included in the wrong location. That said, compiling an accurate address list is no easy task. One reason for this is that people can reside in hidden and non-traditional housing units such as converted attics and basements, as well as in cars, boats, trailers, motels, tent cities, and labor camps. While these living arrangements have long existed, the large number of foreclosures the nation has recently experienced, as well as the natural disasters that have hit the Gulf Coast and other regions, have likely increased the number of people living in less conventional housing. In addition to housing units, which include single-family homes, apartments, and mobile homes, many people also reside in facilities called group quarters, which include prisons, dormitories, nursing homes, and similar locations. The Bureau's database of the nation's roughly 140 million addresses is called the Master Address File, or MAF. As requested, my testimony will describe the preliminary results of 3 MAF building operations that can help locate hidden housing units and other traditionally hard-to-count populations. The operations we reviewed are LUCA, address canvassing, and group quarters validation. I will also provide an update on the IT systems the Bureau will use to update and extract information from the MAF database. My testimony today has 2 main points. First, the Bureau goes to great lengths to ensure the accuracy of the address file using multiple operations that include partnerships with the Postal Service, extensive field verifications, and numerous other activities. Second, the operations we reviewed generally proceeded as planned, and we did not observe any significant operational setbacks. Still, the overall effectiveness of the Bureau's efforts will not be known until later in the census when the Bureau completes various assessments. Turning first to LUCA, the Bureau partnered with state, local, and tribal governments, tapping into their knowledge of local populations and housing conditions in order to develop a more complete and accurate address list. More than 8,000 jurisdictions participated in the program between November 2007 and March 2008. However, LUCA submissions generated a relatively small percentage of additions to the MAF. For example, of around 36 million potential additions that localities submitted, just 2.4 million, or 7%, were new addresses not already in the MAF. The others were duplicate addresses, non-existent, or non-residential. Address canvassing finished ahead of schedule, in part because of improvements the Bureau made to the handheld computers used to collect data, as well as because of lower than expected employee turnover. Nevertheless, the operation exceeded its original budget estimate of $356 million by $88 million, a cost overrun of 25%. A key reason for the overrun was that the Bureau did not update its cost estimates to reflect changes to the address canvassing workload. Further, the Bureau did not follow its staffing strategy and hired too many listers. Recognizing the difficulties associated with address canvassing in the hurricane-affected areas along the Gulf Coast, the Bureau developed supplemental training materials to help listers identify addresses where people are or may be living when census questionnaires are distributed early next year. For example, the materials noted that people might be living in trailers, homes marked for demolition, and non-residential spaces such as storage areas above restaurants. To help ensure group quarters are accurately included in the census, the Bureau is conducting an operation called Group Quarters Validation, which is going on right now. The Census Bureau developed and tested new procedures to improve how it identifies and counts these facilities based on lessons learned from the 2000 census. With respect to the automated system that supports the MAF, although the Bureau has improved aspects of its IT management, we continue to be concerned about the lack of finalized test plans, incomplete metrics to gauge progress, and an aggressive testing and implementation schedule going forward. In summary, the Bureau has taken extraordinary measures to produce a quality address list and associated maps. Still, accurately locating each and every dwelling in the nation is an inherently challenging endeavor, and the overall quality of the Bureau's address list will not be known until later in the census when the Bureau completes the assessments that Dr. Groves mentioned. Chairman Clay, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my remarks, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Goldencock. Mr. Zinser, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McHenry, members of the subcommittee. We appreciate the opportunity to testify today about the Census Bureau's master address file. My testimony covers 3 points, Mr. Chairman. First, building the master address file is an enormously important and enormously complex undertaking. Second, my office has focused a lot of our work on the census operations used to build the file, and not surprisingly, given the enormity of the task, the operations are prone to errors and omissions. Third, Census continues to work very hard to carry out operations to improve the master address file and compensate for those errors and omissions, and the execution of those operations is critically important. The Census Bureau describes an accurate, comprehensive, and timely list as one of the best predictors of a successful census. Errors on the master address file can cause people to be missed or counted more than once, as well as increase costs and the public burden by requiring enumerators to visit non-existent or duplicate locations during the non-response follow-up operation. After the 2000 census, the Bureau launched an ambitious plan to maintain and update both the master address file and the census maps through a variety of operations. They accomplished some of their plans, but still relied on a massive address canvassing operation at the end of the decade as the primary operation for verifying, updating, or deleting addresses, adding missing addresses, updating streets on the maps, and geocoding every structure. Address canvassing employed 140,000 temporary workers and cost over $400 million, not including the costs of the handheld computers. Our work over the decade on the master address file has identified consistent problems. We observed the 2006 site test in Austin in the Cheyenne River Reservation, the 2008 dress rehearsal, and the address canvassing operation itself. My written statement includes examples of the types of errors and omission we observed in those operations, including missing, duplicate, and erroneous master address file addresses, problems with listers not following procedures, and other problems with process and execution. Our work in this area has caused us to have concerns about the overall quality of the address list. The Census Bureau has operations designed to update the 2009 address list and potentially mitigate some of the issues that affect master address file reliability. These include group quarters validation, the LUCA appeals process, new construction adds, and update leave and update enumerate. These represent some of the most significant efforts planned and underway to strengthen and update the master address file. It is critically important that the Bureau execute these operations well. I believe the Census is working hard to do so. However, if we were to be asked what other actions the Census Bureau could take at this point, we would offer 2 suggestions that could assess the quality of the master address file right now and provide information that could be used in subsequent improvement operations and potentially provide the opportunity for additional address list corrections. First, Census should take advantage of housing unit estimates to help assess master address file quality. For the past 20 years, the Bureau has produced annual estimates of housing units for states, counties, and local governments. These statistics are used as controls for several Census Bureau surveys and could be used for the decennial as benchmarks against which potential over- or undercounting of housing could be measured. For example, after Census 2000, count comparisons for over 800 of the nation's most rural counties indicated potential undercoverage in 275 of the counties. Use of housing estimates could identify these types of discrepancies now, before the decennial census, and perhaps steps could be taken to address them. Second, the Bureau could make greater use of administrative records as another source for checking address quality. Such records, collected by all levels of government and the private sector, are used by Census in conducting several of its statistical operations. By matching current administrative records to the master address file, Census could both assess master address file quality and potentially add missing addresses. Even if the Bureau determines that incorporating missed addresses identified in this process would not be feasible at this stage of the decennial, there would still be benefits to assessing the address file and identifying areas where addresses are missing. It would allow subsequent field operations to be alerted on a targeted basis of the high potential for an inaccurate list for that area and the need for greater attention to those areas. Mr. Chairman, this completes my summary, and I'd be happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zenzer. Ms. Jacobs, you may
Thank
proceed.
you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member McHenry and members of the subcommittee for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today about the master address file and to recommend improvements with respect to the development of the master address file. I was glad to hear Dr. Groves refer to the master address file as a big deal, and I'd like to reiterate his statement. It is a very big deal, particularly to the very hard-to-count populations that we represent throughout the 21 rural offices of California Rural Legal Assistance. Our mission is to ameliorate rural poverty and to ensure that rural communities have access to justice and the provision of basic human rights. Therefore, we very much understand the importance of an accurate census and having accurate census data, which starts with an accurate master address file. And I'd like to speak about the adverse impact in the communities we represent of having a less than accurate master address file and make some very practical recommendations for improvements. We represent the hardest to count populations in the hardest to locate housing. We represent farm workers, the rural poor, immigrants, very diverse racial and ethnic groups, linguistically isolated populations, elderly, disabled, and most recently, many foreclosure victims throughout rural California. An inaccurate master address file in a mail-out, mail-back census means that our clients do not have adequate housing, they lack health care, they don't have job training, they have fewer educational opportunities, lower literacy, they have fewer needed municipal services like basic water and sewer, they lack community and economic development programs and resources, and it's harder to enforce the fundamental rights that they have guaranteed by law. The direct impact on local government is very serious because they lack the ability to meet the pressing needs of the hardest to count populations. There are social and economic costs not only to our clients but to the local governments that are there to serve them. My prepared statement describes the structural bias in the development of the master address file. My involvement with the Census Bureau and concern about the master address file started when, after the 1990 census, we participated in a study that measured an at least 50% what we called mega undercount of migrant and seasonal farm workers. And we attribute much of that mega undercount to missing housing units. Not exclusively, but a significant part of that. And the structural bias in the development of the master address file has not been solved. I give a lot of credit to the Census Bureau for making improvements in instructions to address listers about hidden housing units and what types of units to include in the address file, but we still have the problem of complete omission of entire households because in the hardest to count areas, in areas of high concentration of hidden housing units, the master address file is incomplete. And if the master address file for 2010 is incomplete, that means that the master address file for use in the American Community Survey, Census Bureau's replacement for the long form, also will be incomplete, and that will result not only in omission of housing units, but omission of people, and it will carry into the American Community Survey a skewed set of demographic characteristics of the most needy populations, particularly diverse racial and ethnic groups, and the hardest to count populations that we represent. I have made 5 key points and 5 key recommendations in our written testimony. First, the hard-to-locate housing units in rural California and elsewhere need to be understood. They are backyard chicken coops. They are illegal garages. They are tool sheds that are rented out to families to live in. They are single-family units and apartments that are subdivided into essentially one room per complex household, and that can be a family or an extended family per room in a 6-apartment dwelling. They are motel rooms that are occupied by 20 migrant and seasonal farm workers at a time. They are trailer encampments. They are tarps and lean-tos built into canyons, and the kind of housing that is unacceptable in this country, but nevertheless it is spread throughout rural California, and there are many similarities to concentrated urban areas when we talk about these hidden and illegal housing units. And in our study after the 2000 census, and I refer to that in my written testimony, we found that a very high percentage of these types of units were missed in the 7 communities that we evaluated using the Census Bureau's methodology. Secondly, address canvassing does not adequately identify these units, albeit improvements have been made. Thirdly, ultimately, as I said, it skews the population profile because the hidden units tend to be occupied by the hardest to count populations who then become very difficult to profile in the American Community Survey. This has a direct impact on all of our communities throughout the country, and it can be addressed in 2010 and in the ACS. We first recommend that the Census Bureau adopt the address listing protocol that we used in 2000 in the LA region to count migrant and seasonal farm worker units and hidden units, that they implement this address listing protocol, which was recognized by the GAO in its report on farm workers and would extend to other hard-to-count populations. Second, that the Census Bureau work with the regional offices, census partners, community-based organizations, and local governments to identify areas of high concentrations of hard-to-locate housing units and target those for toolkit enumeration operations. And by that I mean specifically utilizing update leave and update enumerate operations within mail-out, mail-back areas, not only in remote areas, because that is where the update leave and update enumerate type operations are utilized. I think they can be effectively utilized within hard-to-count and mail-out, mail-back areas. We also should be using the knowledge of community-based organizations in the LUCA process, which presently the Census Bureau does not do. And the master address file should be evaluated in 2010 in areas of a high concentration of hard-to-locate housing units. That evaluation then could be used to carry over the best practices into the American Community Survey. I know I've run out of time, and I apologize for that. There's a lot more I could say, but I won't. I thank you very much for the opportunity to testify.
Perhaps we will have questions, but thank you, Ms. Jacobs, and thank the entire panel for the testimony. I will now go to the ranking member who has an opening statement, and you can also proceed into your questions.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for coming back and testifying. Dr. Groves, Mr. Goldenkoff in particular, who have been regular in being with us, and I certainly appreciate that. Dr. Groves, thank you for following through on your commitment to testify frequently and keep us apprised of the process. And I do appreciate all the efforts that you've made. But I do think that there's been some troubling news that we've seen since the Senate hearing on October 7th, and that this committee was not previously made aware of. First, the cost overruns, the significant cost overruns. I know they were not available, the cost estimates for address canvassing in your last testimony, Dr. Groves, but certainly 25%. Going over budget by 25% is very significant. Second, although Dr. Groves had informed us at the last census hearing that better cost estimation and control was needed, the Bureau admitted on October 7th that its models were grossly inadequate and can translate into future budgetary problems if not immediately addressed. Third, as the GAO study found that the Bureau's fingerprinting process for temporary workers was deeply flawed and could potentially result in criminals being hired as enumerators. And while I'm disappointed that these issues were not brought to our attention, I have no doubt that the Bureau is actively working to go through and create plans, operating procedures, and budgets that are accurate and proper. But having said that, there are some successes, as the GAO report indicates and as Dr. Grove's testimony indicates as well. The timely and comprehensive completion of address canvassing was certainly a huge success. And the partnership programs, the media campaign efforts have been conducted at an unprecedented level, as no previous census has seen, reaching out to diverse groups of people across this country. And the first major wave of recruitment has met with an applicant pool that was much larger and more qualified than expected. Although the GAO outlines some challenges with that as well. The Bureau has also started with the 2010 local updated census addresses, LUCA, as you all have testified to, that it's been the most effective to date. That is certainly good news, and updating the master address file with that information is certainly good. I want to reiterate my commitment to ensure that that the Bureau stays on track with its planning and execution of the 2010 census. Dr. Groves, you should not limit your communication on issues of concern to just public hearings. We'd certainly appreciate whatever updates you can give us so that certain things like the budget overrun we don't have to find out about through newspapers. And as Chairman Clay has said, and I will reiterate, our doors are open. And I think you'll find that not just the ranking member and the chairman on this committee have their doors open, but all the committee members. We want to make sure that this is the most accurate census in our nation's history, and I think we have the capacity to do that. As Mr. Metzenborg and Dr. Groves have testified, that is their intent and the Bureau's intent. And so thank you for your testimony, and I look forward to hearing your answers to questions. With that, Mr. Chairman, would you like me to just go right into questions? Okay, thank you. Dr. Groves, rehiring the temporary workers that did the address canvassing. I know that's certainly what you've testified to before. In terms of fingerprinting, what procedure will these rehires go through?
I want to make sure I get the question. Are you looking forward to non-response follow-up?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm
okay.
sorry. Going forward, when approximately 570,000, 600,000 are hired for the non-response follow-up, you'll be taking applicants from the original address canvassing pool first, of course, because they've gone through the Bureau training. What is the procedure to check their criminal records?
Well, we will. Let me step back a couple of steps to make sure that I'm answering your question fully. The procedures on the fingerprinting are going through a critical review right now. Mm-hmm. We're going to change some of those procedures with the aspiration that we reduce the problem that we found in address canvassing, which was a failure to read fingerprints from some people. I want to remind the committee that the process by which we hire someone involves first their submission and verification of IDs that provide a Social Security number, a name, sex, and we submit that to the FBI. No one has worked on the decennial census, nor will work on the decennial census, without passing that name check. That will remain true. Okay. In 2000, only that check was used, and now we're adding this fingerprinting process.
Well, we've added the fingerprinting procedure, and I'm sure there are other questions about this procedure, and we'll get to that. But will all these folks that are rehired, that have, for non-response follow-up, will they be fingerprinted, or will you use their original fingerprint and resubmit it?
It's our current intention to use, for those who had fingerprints read, submitted, accepted by the FBI, we will use those prints. For those who didn't have reads on their fingerprints, we will again go through the fingerprinting process.
Okay. And
now I should note that not all of them will be rehired, though. Many of them have gotten other jobs and so on. We will, the exact proportion of rehires versus new hires isn't really known at this point.
And the procedure with those that have fingerprints that cannot be read, will they be hired like they were hired in this address canvassing?
We're after. I don't know how strongly I can say this, Congressman, but the safety of the U.S. public is of paramount interest to us, and I'm committed to doing everything we can to achieve that. We've been working with the FBI after address canvassing, and we've made various changes. And they are, under the guidance of the FBI, what happens is that as you age, as all of us age, our fingerprints get harder to read.
Sure.
The people who didn't have red fingerprints tend to be older and tend to be female, empirically. Yeah. So older women have harder problems in getting
Dr.
fingerprints. Right?
My time is limited, and I know this is important, but if you could submit for this,
I'd be happy to give you a detailed list of things we're doing.
Because I think the GAO in their report would like to see that as well.
I
have another additional thing. I read in USA Today yesterday that the expected response rate for mail, the initial form that will be mailed out on Census Day, is 64%. This is, I think, new information. It was 67% in 2000. There have been some very substantial changes in that we're remailing, in essence, those that do not respond via mail, and which was not done in 2000. So the response rate was supposed to be better than it was in 2000 because of that procedure alone. Why has this been reduced? 3% would equal over $100 million by the initial cost estimates that we have. So it's real money we're talking about. I want to understand why this wasn't brought to our attention earlier and what your answer is on that as well.
Yeah, first of all, the 64% number I didn't approve, so I don't know where that number came from. We are actually estimating that number over and over again. That's a number that will be re-estimated over the coming months. Secondly, it's important and relevant for the committee to know that the response rates of every major national survey in the United States and every Western country is declining. Those response rates are declining each year. The American Community Survey on the mail return rate is declining at between 0.5 and 1 percentage point a year. We have a population that's tougher to measure than it was in 2000. Yeah. We have indeed put in the design features you talked about that go in the other direction that should push it up. But the big change in the population is a massive rock to push up the hill, and we don't know yet how well these design features will work.
Yeah. I mean, I read the press report. It says Census Bureau analysis, which I'd like to know what report.
Analyses.
Well, I'd like to see what you would submit as in what you think the result would be, because certainly, with your history, you certainly are have specialized knowledge in this. We'd like to have that.
I'd be happy to.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. McHenry. Dr. Groves, we know that the accuracy of the master address list relies heavily on close partnerships between the Bureau and local governments. Looking to the future, this partnership will again be called upon year after year to help the Bureau produce accurate annual estimates. We know that the Bureau is altering the Census Challenge methodology. Will the Census be working with local government officials like planners in developing the new methodology? And if so, how?
I want to make sure I understand the question, Congressman. Are you talking about the population estimates program?
Yes.
Okay. Well, as you know, the population estimates program is undergoing review. We've had outside experts in. I'm very interested in this program to get to improve it over the coming decade. We're going to have a lot more dialogue about how best to do that. It's a set of technical issues about how in the middle of the decade you can get the best estimates. The procedures that have been used to work cooperatively with communities to update those estimates are worth reviewing. There are complaints kind of on both sides that ought to be aired, and I want that to happen, and I can assure you that that'll be an open process.
Can the new construction program be expanded to include all additional addresses that cities might have missed in the LUCA process?
Well, as you know, the new construction program is limited to those local governments that have access to new construction administrative records. And that's a smaller set than, for example, the state governments aren't used for that purpose. Right now, under the current legislation, we're limited to governmental entities providing us those updates. But the world is changing, and it's worth talking about the future in various ways.
You know, we are aware that the census plans to hand deliver 1.2 million questionnaires to residents in the Gulf region. This is a great start, but my concern is the follow-up. With the lack of mail receptacles and home telephone service in some of the affected areas, what additional measures will be taken for non-response follow-up?
You know, Congressman, I just spent yesterday at our facility that's assembling the packets for the update. We call this update leave. It's really cool. You ought to do that sometime, visit it sometime. But there are big plastic bags that contain little plastic bags that have questionnaires and a letter from me inside. So they're protected from the rain. They have little hooks on them, so you could hook it inside a screen door if you don't have a mailbox of a house that's clearly inhabitable. Thinking of the Gulf Coast area, as you were just talking about. So I think we're thinking about the same things, and so far I think we're prepared for that. And I can't wait to see how well that works. It's an area that's rapidly changing, as you know.
I know on one of my field visits to the Gulf Coast region, I was told by census workers that in some areas, they have to take boats into the bayou and other places in order to actually, I guess, verify addresses first. And now I guess they will have to drop those packages off by boat also.
You would not believe the kind of transportation our enumerators are seeking. So we also had a request for mules on some Indian reservations because you literally cannot drive a four-wheel drive vehicle up to some of the lodging. So we do a lot of efforts that are unusual.
Wow, you are really preparing for this, aren't you? Please detail the update and leave program that is utilized in rural and Gulf Coast areas. Upon recognition of the addresses of hidden housing units, will there be enough time to input these found addresses before non-response follow-up?
I want to get your question right. Could you repeat that? I want to make sure I answer exactly.
Detail the update
leave
program.
Okay.
That is utilized in rural and Gulf regions.
In the Gulf Coast area, say take New Orleans, in Orleans, Plaquemines, and St. Bernard parishes, these were almost all mail out, mail back in 2000. with the collaboration of local government and civic leaders, we've identified all 3 of those parishes are going to be entirely update leave. So we'll have people on the streets going structure by structure. When a structure, according to a set of fixed rules, is defined as habitable, they will put a questionnaire on those structures. In areas of St. Tammany Parish, the same thing will happen. So as you get away from the coast, things get a little better, and there are certain areas that will do update leave, but they may be surrounded by areas that are mail out, mail back, and all of this is done, is designed to be done in conjunction with local leaders who know what's happening. This is a rapidly changing thing. People are building houses now in New Orleans especially, and we have to be very current to get it right.
And you did say St. Bernard Parish.
St. Bernard's
also
is fully update leave.
Well, it just causes me to ask the question then, could this technique be applied in hard-to-count urban areas?
It could indeed, and a thing that's new, actually, this is relevant to Ms. Jacobs' testimony. One thing that is greatly expanded this decade, I think, is really something that's neat, and that is for all of the census tracts, these are things that small geographical areas that were found to be hard to enumerate in 2000, there's a special plan for every tract. We have people who've already driven every street of those hard-to-enumerate tracts, and they've looked at every house in the tract, and they've asked the question, how best to enumerate this area? If it's a mail-out, mail-back area that they're concerned about, they'll do separate outreach efforts to encourage response. If there are other things going on, they have the freedom to tailor some of the methods they'll use. I'm very hopeful that this kind of customization down to the local level could pay off.
Sounds impressive. Thank you for your response. We would now go to the gentleman from Georgia. 5 minutes, Mr. Westmoreland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First question is for Ms. Jacobs. Ms. Jacobs, in your written testimony here, I noted that, I guess it was in 2003, your organization identified approximately 4,000 units that were not in the MAF, and this was before Mr. Groves, but with your working with the Census Bureau, I think about 75% of them, or a little over 3,000 of them, were included in the MAF. Was this a satisfactory outcome for you?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Westmoreland. We were, of course, thrilled with that outcome, but that outcome was, first of all, limited to the Los Angeles region, and second of all, it was based on a program that we undertook through our education and outreach program in 2000 and funded research that was unusual, and it was, I would say, unique, and it has not been otherwise applied by the Census Bureau. We had census outreach workers who were hired by our organization identifying units that we thought had been missed or were highly likely to be missed, and it was only because the LA region was willing to cooperate in developing this address listing protocol with us and was willing to then take our 4,000 units back, compare them to the master address file, to which we had no access, of course, and then able to add units. But that was not something that had been necessarily approved by headquarters, nor has it since been implemented by headquarters, nor has it been approved or implemented in any other region to our knowledge. But I think that that is an approach that certainly could be used, and when I referred in my oral testimony to the address listing protocol, that is what I meant. And I think that the Bureau has implemented a similar protocol for the targeted, non-sheltered outdoor locations, but that is going to be essentially a one-day operation, and it will not it is primarily to reach the homeless. It will not necessarily reach any of the hardest to count populations that we are concerned about.
I noticed that in Mr. Grove's testimony, I believe he said that there was an outreach to approximately 28,000, I guess, different governments, whether it's city, county, state, or tribal or whatever. Only about 14,000 of those had responded to, I believe, be in the program. Are you encouraging some of the local governments where you're at? Because I know I read your protocol and what you're talking about, people being familiar with the area and the community, being involved in this. Do you see a role for some of these governments to play in it that could help in that?
Certainly, yes, and I think that the Census Bureau has a good partnership program, and CRLA community outreach workers are a part of that program. We participate on complete count committees in many local jurisdictions, and we encourage local jurisdictions to participate. One of the limitations of LUCA, however, is that community-based organizations cannot participate, and I think it would be an enormous benefit to local governments as well as to the Census Bureau to make use of the knowledge of community-based organizations on the ground in those communities that could really provide assistance to very strapped local governments.
Thank you. Dr. Groves, it's good to see you again, and we do appreciate your feeling of your commitment to come in front of us often and let us ask you questions. One comment I will make, Mr. McHenry mentioned the cost overruns. I will tell you that I've had several people across the country in the real estate business tell me that the Census Bureau in different locations was paying anywhere from $52 to $55 a square foot for office buildings. And at some point, if you want to come by the office, I'll give you some of those locations, because right now, typical office space is anywhere from $8 to $10 a foot. So you might want to check some of that out for your cost overrun. But Dr. Groves, does the Census Bureau pay any outside groups to address, to add addresses to this master address file? Do y'all contract with anybody, pay anybody to do that?
To add addresses to the file. The base of the master address file for this decade started with the 2000 census master address file. If you go back into the history of this, we assemble records in that decade from various commercial sources, but we've been updating that now. So to know the origin of actually every address in there is kind of tough at this point. But this operation that we've done over this decade has relied heavily on the Postal Service. I don't know how you count that in your thoughts, but that's been a chief updating source for us.
Okay. And one final question, it'll be a short one, I think. How do you think the budget overruns in conducting the address canvassing over the summer will impact your ability to effectively administer the 2010 census?
Those budget overruns are intolerable to me, Congressman. And I believe, as I mentioned previously, I think, to the committee, that part of it was from a flaw in the cost modeling logic. That logic has been changed. The cost model, our big operation going forward, as you know, is the non-response follow-up operation. And we're undergoing two independent cost modeling schemes. One has been partially completed, the other's going on now. I want to compare multiple ways of estimating the cost because I think that's the way to protect your estimation. This is a very complicated process. I don't want to imply that it's easy to do. It's very important, though, to get this right. I am pleased that this operation that we're doing right now called group quarters validation, where we're going out to 2 million addresses, appears to be on time, on budget, and that's a good thing. We can't tolerate these kind of overruns in our big operation, and it's not going to happen on my watch as long as I'm in this position anyway, I'll tell you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Westmore. Mr. Zinser, have you had further results or reviews of the paper-based operations control system? If so, please detail some of your findings.
Sir, we don't have any further results from the review of the paper-based operations control system, but we include that system as a top risk to the census because of the late change to paper-based operations. There's a lot of changes that have to be done to that system, and that has to be a front and center focus item for the census, and we count that as a major factor in trying to determine whether or not the costs are going to be contained.
I see. Dr. Groves, did you want to add
I'd be happy
anything?
to comment on. I mean, I agree.
Sure.
It's deserving of scrutiny by my two colleagues here and me continuously.
Okay.
We have a big test I want to announce coming up in around Thanksgiving. That's a big deal for us. We got to hit that. We hope to break the system in Thanksgiving in order to make sure it's robust for the real use.
Thank you for that response. Mr. Zinser, how can the non-response follow-up operations be made more efficient? Please respond to the question in terms of cost and effectiveness. You do have some history with which to evaluate this, I assume.
I didn't catch the last part of the question, sir.
No, I'm asking if you have any history to evaluate the non-response follow-up and its effectiveness and cost efficiency.
Yes, sir. I think our plan for evaluating non-response follow-up is to, similar to how we handled address canvassing, is that we dispatch teams out to the field to actually observe the non-response follow-up operation. And by putting our folks out in the field and observing how the enumerators are operating, we hope to identify problems early, alert the Census Bureau to those problems, and then they make changes. We did that, for example, with address canvassing when we observed a number of listers in 5 different regions that we were in not following procedures. They were supposed to go up and knock on the door so they could get a good map spot with the handheld computer. They weren't doing that. We alerted the Census Bureau and they took corrective action. I think that's pretty much our strategy for covering non-response follow-up.
To what degree will the accuracy of the master address file be affected by the Census Bureau's inability to track schedules, costs, and risk management activities of this endeavor? Do you have any figures for this?
I don't think I have any figures for that, sir, but the construction of the master address file, as we've all testified here this morning, is a key operation, and what our suggestion is that they do some data analysis of the quality of the master address file right now to include using housing unit estimates and some administrative records to match against the master address file to try to target those areas where there might be problems with the quality of the file.
What specific risk management activities are behind schedule with regard to the master address file?
Are behind schedule?
Yes.
Well, they have the Census Bureau has identified probably somewhere in the area of 24 high-risk areas, and they're developing contingency plans for probably around 11 of those. One of those is called the I have to get my glasses out, sir. One of those is called the Housing Unit Duplicates and Misses. It's a contingency plan that they are working on, but it's not completed. And I don't think they have any scheduled date for completing it. So I would list that as a key area to get some progress on.
I see. Thank you for that response. Mr. Goldenkoff, is it true that the FBI has continued to express concerns regarding the Bureau's poor paper, ink, fingerprinting quality? Can the FBI guarantee a quick turnaround of the check results following the fingerprint submissions? And if the FBI cannot guarantee a quick turnaround, what is the Bureau's contingency plan?
I'm not aware of any contingency plan that the Bureau would have if there is no quick turnaround. These operations are very short-lived. and very often the people are hired and will be hired during non-response follow-up during the operation or right before it's to begin. So there's just really a very short window that the Bureau would have in order to conduct these fingerprints and get the results back.
How can best practices be utilized to ensure the Bureau provides a more reliable cost estimate for additional endeavors such as non-response follow-up, especially in light of the 25% over budget for address canvassing?
Well, certainly the Bureau does need to rely on best practices and employ them. GAO has put out a guide to best practices for cost estimation. This has been a long-standing weakness with the Bureau. What we've seen is that the Bureau's cost estimates have lacked detailed documentation. The sources and assumptions that they've made were very weak or lacking. They were not comprehensive in the sense that all costs weren't included. And one of the things I'd just like to bring up right now, we've heard talk, Dr. Groves had mentioned about they're revisiting the mail response rate. Well, that has a huge impact for the final cost of the census. A 1 percentage point change in response rate, either way, can have tens of millions of dollars worth of implications for the final cost of the census. So that would be something right off the bat that, it's great that the Bureau is looking at that, but the question I would have is to what extent is that being reflected in their cost estimates?
Thank you. Mr. Chaffetz, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you all. And I know you all believe that the integrity in the process is paramount to successful completion and confidence by the American people. So, Director Groves, I'd like you to get as specific as you can about the policy and procedures. Hopefully they're written, is to the criteria, what would exclude somebody from joining on and joining the census. We hear reports about criminals being hired to conduct the census. That's concerning to a lot of people, including myself. Well, what point, at what threshold do you say this person is not qualified? And to what degree are people qualified even though they might have a criminal background?
I can supply that information. As you might guess, Congressman, publishing that information would provide a set of people information that would allow them to game that system in a way that might be harmful to the safety of the U.S. public. I can tell you how we go about this. We receive from the FBI on those names or fingerprints that generate a criminal history the nature of the offenses. As you know, the FBI database doesn't completely give the disposition of all those offenses. So we review this, we give a chance to the applicant to provide counter information, and there are a set of crimes that are basically more serious than others where the applicant would fall out. I can tell you in the fingerprinting side that about 58%, I believe, of those that had a criminal history come back from the FBI based on fingerprints were eliminated from the group. 42% stayed in because these were crimes that were judged not to threaten the safety of the U.S. public.
So, at least according to I'm reading on page 13 of the GAO report, midway through the first complete paragraph, of the 1,800 workers with criminal records, approximately 750, or 42%, were terminated. So it would be the other way around. 58% were actually allowed to stay. Right? The number at 58 would be consistent. Why? How do we allow somebody with a criminal record to participate in the enumeration process in the United States Census? I mean, I can't think of any threshold that would allow that I would have any confidence in allowing somebody to go knock on grandma's door and invite themselves in to further discuss very pertinent personal information. I don't understand what threshold of criminal activity is acceptable by the census.
I'd be happy to go through this process if you'd like.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking the question.
The list of crimes that I talked about before are things that, I'm sorry? I'm sorry. The process by which we make these judgments is totally driven by our concerns about the safety of the U.S. public.
So why not exclude all of them?
Because in the judgment of the process going on, these don't harm the safety of the American public. They can't.
And that's a subjective point of view that you're just personally making in some, I mean, who's making these decisions?
I'd be happy to review this with you whenever you want, Congressman.
Right now would be ideal.
I don't have the list of the offenses in front of me, but I could.
I'm concerned that it's a subjective criteria. It's not an objective criteria. I think if you are going in and you're asking for personal sensitive information about their names, their addresses, about what my 8-year-old daughter's birthday is, I can't find anybody with a criminal record that I would feel comfortable giving that information to. Meanwhile, we have literally millions and millions and millions of good, hard-working, honest Americans without criminal backgrounds that are just dying to get an employment. I can find no excuse for allowing somebody to deal with that sensitive information into the American people's homes. And based on the information I'm seeing, Mr. Chairman, we've got over 1,000 of them at least, and that number is probably much, much greater than that. And I have a deep, deep concern. GAO points out that crimes such as rape, manslaughter, child abuse are being dismissed. I appreciate that, but there are a whole lot of other crimes that I wouldn't express confidence in either. So, Mr. Chairman, I see that my time has expired. I just want, for the record, I would like to exercise my right to have 5 minutes for each member of the panel, but I want to be sensitive and
another round of
fair enough. I yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you.
My expired time.
Ms. Watson, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I really want to thank you for having this hearing today. I can't think of a more significant and a crucial hearing when it relates to the Census Bureau's ongoing compilation of the master address file. And based on the time-tested theory that the quality of output can only be as good as the quality of input, the MAF is key to what we can expect to learn about the United States and the changes its population has gone in the last decade. I think everyone knows I come from the largest state in the Union, California, and 38 million people, and we get 2,000 immigrating into our state on a daily basis, and they surprisingly don't all come from over the border. They come from across the Pacific. And so we're the first state in the Union that is a majority of minorities, and that brings a whole lot of different qualities to the count. And I'm sorry I missed the first part of the panel, because I know you've given us very vital information. And so I would like to know what challenges must be met to ensure a one-to-one match between the residents of the nation and the Census Bureau's address book, and who we know is likely to be left out or undercounted, misunderstood, or intimidated into concealment if the federal government's message, methods, or motives lack transparency. Now, once every 10 years, I bring someone from the census into my office, and I say, now let me tell you, if you're going to get an accurate count in my district, you're going to go upstairs over the liquor store, you're going to come out on Sunday without your clipboard, and you're going to go to the playground at the school or at the church or at the park. because that's where you're going to find a lot of people coming out of those cramped apartments with their children. So, so much depends on getting a picture of who we are in America and how we go about counting them. And so, if I can, Dr. Groves, and if you've already addressed this, then I'll take the record as my information. But an amendment has been proposed in the Senate's bill, and for a fiscal appropriation bill for fiscal 2010 that would require the 2010 census to ask about citizenship. And how do you believe this would affect the bill's ability to perform a full and accurate count?
Thank you for the question. As you may know, we have printed over 400 million forms already. I visited one of our facilities that had 7 stacks of pallets in 400,000 square feet filled with printed forms, already stuffed, ready to be delivered. The most serious problem of changing the census now,
Dr. Groves, I know that I think staff has a photograph of the very senior saying, and I don't intend to take your time, and I asked Mr. Chairman if you'd make your time whole, but there's a picture that you're referencing of those printed forms. I thought it'd be a useful visual for those here today.
It is an impressive picture, I believe.
Go ahead. You may proceed, Ms. Watson.
Dr. Groves was responding.
Oh, yes, it is.
So the Census Bureau, before I got there, followed the regulations on how we should behave. In 2007, the topics of the questionnaire were submitted to the Hill, and for comment, for addition. That was a moment to add a topic. And then in the middle of 2008, we delivered to the Hill, according to regulations, the exact questions to be asked. And at that time, there were no added questions asked. I can say with absolute confidence that if we add a question to this census questionnaire at this point, we will not deliver the reapportionment counts on December 31st, 2010. We will not provide the data for redistricting. We don't have enough time to make these changes.
Okay, let me just, what you're saying is that you have not considered immigration on this farm.
I'm saying that the addition of a question about...
No, you have not. I just wanted to know, is there any indication, any question relative to immigration on the farm? Yes,
no?
Not
at all. Not at all.
Okay, all right. Now, I'm also concerned about home foreclosure and the number of people who have been forced out of their homes and on the streets, and the rising jobless rates means more Americans are leaving their homes and living in a constant shifting and non-traditional arrangement, such as in their cars, in tent cities, and on the couches of various friends and family members. And all the while, increased financial hardships may make some Americans less willing to cooperate with the census workers. What challenges has the economic and housing foreclosure crisis posed to the collection of a complete master address file?
There are two things I'm worried about. I'm worried less about the master address file than the actual enumeration. The foreclosed homes, I was in LA 2 days ago, are largely empty now. Some are not habitable now. Mm-hmm. We're going to spend money on those houses by knocking on the door after we mail a questionnaire to those houses. So there's a cost implication of foreclosures. I'm also worried about the doubling up problem of homes that are the result of that foreclosure. There, we're redoubling our efforts to make sure people get the message, if you have some family members living with you in that state, to include them where they live with you, even though you may not think of them as part of your home permanently. because they don't have another residence, they need to be counted where they are. And then the other thing you mentioned is absolutely...
What about those living in the cars?
Yeah. In L.A., I rode street after street where there are RVs parked one after the other, and they stay there for 3 days, and then they move to another neighborhood because of the parking regulations. There are people living in these RVs. These are people who were well off enough to have an RV 2 years ago, but that's all they have now. This is a challenge for us in what Ms. Jacobs talked about, this 3-day period where we measure these non-traditional living situations. It's a new challenge for us. Our local, regional folks are all over this problem, but it's going to be a challenge.
I will agree with you. I represent Los Angeles, Culver City, Hollywood. I see them on the streets every day. And an undercount has been constant in various areas. Every decade there's an undercount. Therefore, the representation is off a little bit. The resources that would flow in, that would follow the numbers in various categories, we lose. So it's really important. I think that even numerators who have been incarcerated can be rehabilitated and can be very helpful in some areas of the community where they recognize these people and they feel more comfortable giving up the information about how many live in a particular house and so on. I mean, I have apartments in my district where they hotbed. There might be a dozen people in a one-bedroom apartment. Somebody whose face might be familiar, somebody who has the charisma and so on, non-threatening type, could probably give us a more accurate number. So I'm all for your figuring out ways to count these people. I think my time might be up, but anyway, let me go on to Mr. Zinsser, and if it's up, Mr. Chairman.
It's up, but we will have a second round.
Okay, all right.
All right.
Yeah, I'll yield
ma'am.
back, and I'll wait.
I thank the gentlewoman. Mr. McHenry, you're recognized for your second
Thank you,
round
Mr.
of
Chairman.
questions.
Mr. Goldnikoff, I want to start with you. I actually reviewed your Senate report and testimony, and you've added quite a bit to your testimony today. But the one essential part that is largely the same, I believe, is dealing with the cost. Is that true?
That's correct.
Okay. So forgive me if I'm referencing the Senate section here, but you report. For example, the Bureau had planned for 25% of new hires to quit before, during, or soon after training. However, the national average was 16%. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Bureau officials said that not having to replace listers with inexperienced staff accelerated the pace of operation. Is that the way you write that? Is it's basically a report from the Bureau. Did you find that was true based on your analysis?
Well, we did not independently confirm the numbers, but based on our knowledge of the census and census operations, we could see how that could be both a cost savings and also make the operation more efficient. Basically, among other things, it saves you training. For example, the people work all the way through. They're also more experienced. They know their jobs better. There's not that learning curve. So it would certainly make sense. That would improve the pace of the operation. Okay. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting that perhaps that lesson alone, to know that, you know, because of perhaps the economic situation that we're in, that people are sticking through the job. That's
right?
correct.
And the applicants are stronger to begin with.
That's correct.
Right. So therefore, we see perhaps a better result from our non-response follow-up coming up based on that experience.
It's possible. That's correct. There's a, you know, you could make the argument that there is a better workforce going into non-response follow-up, you know, in the sense that they have an employment history, they have a work ethic. In the past, the Census Bureau has relied on, and for the 2000 census, a part-time strategy, basically part-time employees, you know, underemployed people. But to the extent that you have a very skilled workforce now that's looking for work, those people tend to be better employees and more responsible.
Additionally, you said that what was the key cost overrun? What was the largest failure of the Bureau with this cost overrun?
There was actually several reasons for it.
I know in your
report,
report,
a big reason was they underestimated the workload, the address canvassing workload. There were additional, I think around 11 million additional addresses that they hadn't counted on. Some of those came from LUCA, some of those came from other sources. Each one of those addresses had to be verified in the field, and that's labor intensive and costly.
Sure. You mentioned 11 million, which it says in your report that 11 million addresses were included that were not in their original 2009 budget. Is that true?
That's correct.
Okay. And that was one of the largest dollar amount increases.
I believe so. That and the fact that they hired more listers than they needed to because they didn't stick to their staffing model.
Okay. Dr. Groves, in light of this, what are you doing to make sure that you don't have a massive cost overrun for all the processes that we have going forward?
Yeah.
I mean, a 25% cost overrun is extraordinary.
I think you could classify the things we're doing under two categories. One is changing. I view this as a combination of top-down cost modeling, where you take the 2000 estimates, you update them by what has changed, and then you derive a new cost estimate, versus a bottom-up approach, where you get the components of the activities, you cost each one, and you aggregate it up. The typical Bureau approach is to do a top-down cost model. Those have been updated based on master address canvassing results, the new hiring and attrition rates, and we've changed the staffing model going forward, so it took advantage of the information properly done. That's a good thing to do, but I don't think it's sufficient, and so we're also building a model from the bottom up, getting activity level costs and then aggregating it up. And I want to compare those to aggregate cost estimates.
My time has expired, but in closing, you were here after the end, when address canvassing had ended. That was about the approximate time you testified. And you didn't want to discuss the cost of this in that hearing. With a 25% cost overrun, it seems to me unfathomable that you did not know that there would be significant cost overruns. And what I've said in every meeting with you personally, in public, and what the chairman has said as well, and I think just about every member of this committee, is that we want to be of assistance here. And if you keep us in the dark about challenges or problems, including $88 million that was not budgeted for, it seems to me that you were not keeping us apprised of this, and that's rather disappointing. And I would hope that whoever is counseling you to hold back on that information, that you don't listen to that counsel, that you come forward and let us know as soon as problems occur, because we do want to be of assistance. We want to make sure that everything is there for you so you can have the best, most accurate count. And I know that's what the Bureau wants. I know that's what you personally want. But you need to keep us informed on this. And I can understand if you didn't know a 3% cost overrun, but 25%, for heaven's sakes, that seems to me unfathomable that you didn't know that. And so I would encourage you to come forward as soon as you know there are any problems or challenges, and we do want to be of assistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McHenry. Mr. Jacobs, you mentioned in your testimony that many housing units of migrant and seasonal farm workers are not in the master address file because they are actively concealed. What do you mean by actively concealed?
Well, I think there are several reasons for active concealment, and what I mean about that is that ranging from the owners and operators of that housing not wanting it to be seen and therefore disguising it or hiding it as best they can, to the occupants of that housing not wanting to be discovered because they are living in what would be considered illegal units or living where they think they're not supposed to. For example, they're hidden under tarps and lean-tos in the canyons in San Diego County or in LA County in onion fields. They're living in between trees under tarps. These are circumstances where they are trying not to be seen because they will be dislocated from the housing, they might be evicted, they might be threatened if they remain there. And when the owners of the property or the owners of the illegal housing units believe that they will be either prosecuted or sued, for example, by CRLA for maintaining uninhabitable dwellings for their workers, they will try to actively conceal those units. So that can be difficult for the Census Bureau, but I don't think active concealment is the biggest problem that we have.
How can the Census Bureau get a better count of these populations?
Well, I think the example that we gave in our written testimony, which was also cited in 2003 by the GAO report on the address listing protocol that we used, is the best example. We have trusted faces in the community. We have reliable community outreach workers that work for local community-based organizations who know where this housing is located, who can work in partnership with the Census Bureau to assist both in address listing and in enumeration of these locations. They know where they are, they're trusted by the occupants, and they can go a long way to opening doors, so to speak, for the Census Bureau.
You know, the deplorable conditions of housing for immigrant workers are not confined to migrant farm workers. Recent immigrants to this country have the same living conditions in cities. Just as Ms. Watson pointed out, what are some examples of low visibility units in cities that do not have postal addresses, and how are they reached by census workers?
I think that the problems in isolated rural areas and the types of housing in which migrant and seasonal farm workers live are very similar to the small towns in agricultural communities, as well as many of the inner city areas where there are illegal units that are being rented out. There are illegal garages that are being rented out. Underneath someone's porch is being rented out as a habitable, in quotes, dwelling. Again, there's local knowledge of where these units are, and more importantly, I think that the Census Bureau's own hard-to-count database can be improved, enhanced, and utilized to target special enumeration procedures in areas that have a high concentration of hidden housing units. I think that can be used in rural areas as well as in inner city urban areas, and it should be done regardless of whether those areas are considered mail-out, mail-back areas. They still need to be targeted for enumeration that is not done by mail, or we will miss not only entire housing units, but we will continue to have people omitted from households.
You know, speaking of omissions, in 1990 it was estimated that 48 to 52% of the migrant seasonal farm workers were undercounted. A large part of the undercount was attributed to total household omissions. What is the extent of these problems heading into the 2010 decennial? What do you see them as?
I believe that 2010 will have very similar problems. I give the Census Bureau credit for developing improved job aids and improved instructions and training to their address listers and enumerators, but I think that a lot more needs to be done in order to ensure that the locations are identified for the Census Bureau so that addresses can be added to the address file at any time through non-response follow-up as well as during the decade, and so that, again, these areas can be targeted for special enumeration procedures.
What suggestions do you have for collaboration between the Bureau and groups like yours to get these addresses in the file?
Well, we certainly take advantage of the partnership opportunities that the Census Bureau offers, and we encourage and we train other community-based organizations to do the same. I think, however, that the Census Bureau could make better and more use of local knowledge and community-based organizations in its LUCA process, as well as in address canvassing, and by using the special protocol that we described in our written testimony.
Thank you so much for your response. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goldenkopf, I'd like to go back to the questioning we were doing with Director Groves, talking specifically about the criminal element that this seems to be acceptable to Census Bureau. Can you give me your perspective on that situation? And are there criteria, the objective, the subjective? And how many people are we talking about here?
I don't know. We have not seen the actual list. I mean, obviously some crimes are less severe than others, but which ones will allow you with census jobs and which ones will not, we don't know because we haven't seen the list.
Is there any written criteria for this, or is this just something that is just done on the fly and very subjective?
We have not looked into that, so I do not know.
Sir, can I address that?
Yes, please.
I became the IG of Commerce in late December '07, January '08. By February of '08, we were alerting the department and the Census Bureau that they had to get on this fingerprint issue.
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't prepared for it. And it took them 6 to 8 months to get ready for fingerprinting. And the original estimates for fingerprinting were up in the $600 and $700 million. Our office worked with them for 6 or 7 months working on their cost estimate. There is criteria, and there's criteria in other federal jobs also. My most recent experience before Commerce was the transportation and transportation security. There are common lists of offenses that the federal government refers to in terms of whether somebody's qualified or disqualified. One of the things we recommended for the Census Bureau was, in the past, they would let local or regional offices make determinations on which crimes are disqualifying and which crimes aren't. We recommended that they centralize that in an office called CHECK. I can't tell you what that exactly stands for, but there is an office in Census headquarters that has centralized these kind of determinations, and we think that's a good practice.
Is there written criteria?
Yes, there is. I think that doesn't eliminate all subjectivity. I think you do have to make some judgments. For example, how long ago the offense occurred. Is it a misdemeanor? Is it a felony? Is it a violent crime, nonviolent crime? And I also know that the Census Bureau has been consulting with the FBI on those types of issues.
My concern is that we just are somewhat in the dark on this. And again, it's the giving the confidence and of the integrity of the process and the people that are going to be knocking on their door. Because unlike most other federal jobs, you're actually going to be going up and approaching somebody in their home and asking for sensitive information that can lead to other nefarious types of activities, and thus the concern. There are certainly a number of other types of government jobs that somebody with a criminal background can participate in, whether it's the Department of Transportation or member of Congress. I mean, whatever it might be, right? But in terms of the census, I think there's a great deal of sensitivity. Going back to Director Groves, how many people are we talking about? Because at least the way I read and interpret the numbers from the GAO report, we're talking over 1,000 people. It's not a small, hey, we got a handful here or there. And I recognize the totality of the effort that's going on. But this seems like a rather large, and I sense a degree of secrecy that you want to keep from this committee in allowing us to understand what is, so they can't, quote unquote, game the system, that I just find wholly unacceptable. And I think there is a great deal of fear that will be created, probably on the other end of it, by being so secretive about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable.
I can say, Congressman, that everything we do is in compliance with OPM guidelines that are indeed published. I don't have those with me, but I can supply those. So we're following that as well as we can. I think the other thing to note, just to make sure that I'm communicating the facts correctly, is that the existence of a record in the FBI doesn't imply conviction of a crime.
So if somebody has been charged with a crime but not convicted, are they allowed to be an enumerator?
What happens then is that the applicant is required by us to provide court certified documentation on the outcome of the case.
Are they, if they have not,
following the OPM guidelines.
and we're talking about tens of thousands of people here who have not completed the background process, that is, they have not had their fingerprinting processed by the FBI, are those people allowed to start work even though they haven't completed that process? Because it looks like, based on what's been going on in surveying and going out to all the neighborhoods and trying to figure out the maps and all that, that those people have actually been employed and working despite what ultimately concluded was unacceptable, nefarious behavior.
Yeah, this group has universally passed the FBI name check that's based on name, date of birth, Social Security.
Do you use E-Verify?
We do use E-Verify as part of the employment process. In addition to that, then we do the FBI name check. So everyone has passed that.
So all of those names have gone through the E-Verify process?
All of those names have gone, to my knowledge, have gone through the E-Verify process.
The gentleman from Utah's time has
Understood.
expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, Dr. Gross, does the Bureau have a set of internal procedures and policies on what is a disqualifier in terms of criminal record?
Yes.
Mr. Goldenkoff, has that been verified by
Yeah, we do have, yes.
Yes.
They do.
Okay. Mr.
Yes, sir, I've seen them.
All right. Mr. Gross, are you confident that there are no violent criminals that work for the Census Bureau?
I'm confident that the people employed by the Census Bureau have gone through this process and have been judged as not having a criminal history under the process.
Sure. And would the three of you agree to follow up with Mr. Chaffetz and his staff in regards to his line of questioning?
Be happy to.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you all for that, and thank you for your testimony today. Thank you.
Yield?
Sure, sure.
Thank you. I won't keep everybody all day. I
Gentlemen
promise. I
asked the chairman for 1 minute, so I think you've got about...
Okay. Thank you. What percentage of the people going through the process go through the fingerprinting process? 100%. Is that correct?
We don't hire anyone who doesn't pass the name check. All the people who pass the name check then are submitted to the fingerprinting. Who we wish to hire are submitted.
And how long does it take from the person, they fill out their application, then
this
the
is
FBI,
done on
are
the
they
first
taking...
day of training. There are 2 cards made
Right.
by 2 different fingerprinters. Those cards are FedEx to our National Processing Center and then electronically transmitted to the FBI. The turnaround time on the FBI was in the last operation was about 22 hours. That process seems to be working. We beefed up the electronic pipeline to that. So, and we're doing a big load test of that. We're going to simulate a million hires through the FBI submission process just to make sure we can do that volume when we have to.
Biggest concern that you have at this moment, all things considered, what's your biggest concern?
About what? About the entire 2010
the totality of the process. When you wake up in the morning and say, oh my goodness, this is my biggest concern, what would it be?
I'm most worried about the behavior of the American public, whether they will return this questionnaire at the rates we hope they will, and that the leadership of this country ignites and energizes themselves to encourage that participation. We need you at this moment.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Chaffetz. And the director couldn't summarize it better. I want to thank the panel for your testimony today, and that concludes the hearing. Hearing adjourned.